The silence was the first thing that struck him. It was a dense, unnatural quiet, the kind that absorbs sound rather than reflects it. Elias Vance stood in the doorway of the home he had helped build, not just with money, but with his own 2 hands, and felt the wrongness of it settle deep in his bones. The air was still, heavy with the ghosts of unspoken words and the cloying sweetness of Amelia's perfume, a scent she only wore when she was leaving for something important. He had always associated it with galas, with award dinners, with the glittering life she pursued with an almost religious fervor. Now it smelled like an embalming fluid. He dropped his heavy tool bag by the door, the clatter of metal on hardwood unnaturally loud, an intrusion on the reverent hush. He called her name once. The word died in the hallway, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. He walked through the lower floor, a creeping dread coiling in his stomach. Everything was too neat, too perfect. The throw pillows on the sofa were arranged with geometric precision. The magazines on the coffee table were fanned out just so. It was a staged room, a museum exhibit of a life that had, until that morning, been messily and beautifully lived in. His gaze caught on the mantelpiece, a thick slab of reclaimed oak he had spent a month sanding and staining to a dark, honeyed finish. The photos were still there, their wedding, a trip to the coast, him holding a blueprint with a proud, tired smile. But something was missing. A small silver frame that had held a picture of Amelia accepting her first major architectural award was gone. It was a small detail, a tiny crack in the facade, but through it Elias saw the chasm. The kitchen was where he found it. The note was a single sheet of expensive cream-colored stationery, the kind Amelia used for her most important clients, propped against the gleaming chrome of the espresso machine he'd bought her for their anniversary. Her handwriting, usually a fluid and elegant script, was tight, controlled, as if each letter had been formed under immense pressure. It was not a long note, it was a statement of fact, a closing argument, in a trial he hadn't known he was a part of. She was leaving. She had met someone, a man named Julian Croft, a senior partner at her firm. A man who, she wrote, understood her ambitions. A man who could give her the life she deserved. There was no apology. There were only justifications, wrapped in the cold language of personal growth and unavoidable truths. It was a corporate memo announcing a hostile takeover of his life. Beside the note, sitting on the cold granite countertop, was her wedding ring, a simple platinum band they had chosen together, and a diamond he had worked a year of overtime to afford. It was placed with a cruel, deliberate precision, catching the last of the afternoon light, a tiny, glittering monument to all the promises that now lay shattered. He stared at it, his own hand calloused and scarred from years of turning wrenches and hauling timber, feeling heavy and clumsy at his side. He had built this house. He had laid the floors, wired the lights, repaired the plumbing. He had built a life within these walls, a foundation he thought was solid, made of trust and shared history. Now he saw it for what it was, a movie set, and the leading lady had just walked off, taking the script with her. As the initial shock began to recede, replaced by a hollow, ringing numbness, another realization settled in, heavier and colder than the first. He was not alone in the wreckage. He heard a faint sound from upstairs, the muffled thump of music through headphones. Chloe, Amelia's younger sister. When their parents had died in a car crash 2 years prior, Chloe, then a volatile and grief-stricken 16-year-old, had come to live with them. Amelia had treated it as a noble inconvenience, a social burden to be managed. But Elias had seen the terrified kid beneath the black eyeliner and angry music. He had been the one to sit with her through panic attacks, to help her with homework, to quietly make sure she ate. Amelia was her legal guardian, but he had become her anchor. And now the note confirmed with a single, chilling sentence. Amelia was renouncing that responsibility as well. "Chloe is better off with you," it read. "You've always been better at that sort of thing." It was a final, casual abdication, leaving him not just with a broken heart and an empty house, but with the fragile, fractured life of a teenage girl he now had to raise alone. He sank onto a stool, the granite cold against his forearms. The secondary burden settled upon him, a physical weight. It was not just Chloe, it was the bills. He handled the practical finances, the mortgage, the utilities, the car payments. Amelia handled what she called lifestyle investments, her designer wardrobe, the expensive dinners, the charity galas that were essential for networking. He knew they were stretched thin, living on the edge of his steady construction foreman's salary and her burgeoning architect's income. He had trusted her. He had believed it was all part of building their future. Now, alone in the silent, perfumed kitchen, he suspected the truth was far uglier. He was not just abandoned, he was likely ruined. The foundation was not just cracked, it had been dynamited. If stories about resilience, the price of loyalty, and the kind of love that survives the wreckage speak to you, stay with me. This was not just an ending. For Elias Vance, standing in the ruins of the life he knew, it was the first day of a war he never wanted to fight, a war he would have to win, not for revenge, but for survival. He picked up the ring, its cold weight, a final, definitive period on a chapter of his life. The metal felt foreign, lifeless. He closed his fist around it, the edges digging into his palm, a small, sharp pain in the vast, echoing numbness. The house was no longer a home, it was a site, a demolition zone. And from the rubble, he would have to find a way to build again. The first weeks were a blur of mechanical motion. Elias operated on a reserve of fuel he didn't know he possessed, a grim autopilot that got him out of bed in the morning and collapsed him back into it at night. The house, once a source of pride, became a hostile environment, each room a repository of memories that ambushed him. The smell of Amelia's perfume lingered in the closet, a spectral presence. The indentation of her head remained on her pillow. He started sleeping on the sofa, the unfamiliar cushions offering a strange, Spartan comfort. He worked with a frantic energy, throwing himself into his job at Northgate Construction, seeking refuge in the familiar logic of blueprints and the cathartic exhaustion of physical labor. He needed the overtime. The first wave of credit card statements had arrived, addressed to Amelia, and the numbers inside were staggering. It was a mountain of debt, a secret ledger of a life she had been living without him. His world shrank to two zones, the chaotic, dusty construction site and the quiet, tense house. He tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Chloe. He made breakfast, ensured she got to school, feigned an interest in the teenage dramas she occasionally shared. But he was a ghost at his own table. His responses were delayed, his smiles were thin, and his eyes were perpetually fixed on some distant point of pain. Chloe, in turn, retreated further into herself. She saw his grief and, terrified of adding to it, swallowed her own. The silence in the house grew louder, filled with the things neither of them knew how to say. The space Amelia had vacated became a vacuum, pulling all the warmth and noise from their lives. His performance at work, his one remaining sanctuary, began to suffer. He was a good foreman, known for his sharp eye and his calm demeanor under pressure, but now his focus was fractured. He missed a crucial error in a shipment of steel beams, an oversight that cost the company a day of work and thousands of dollars. He was short-tempered with his crew, men who had respected him for years. His boss, a gruff but fair man named Marcus Thorne, pulled him aside. "Vance," he'd said, his voice rough with concern, "get your head right. Whatever's going on at home, you leave it there. This job requires 100%. You're giving me 50. Elias had just nodded, unable to form the words to explain that his home was a crater and his head was a war zone. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It was a grey, drizzling afternoon that mirrored the perpetual fog in his mind. He had just finished a grueling 10-hour shift, his body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. He was sitting in his truck in the company parking lot, rain streaking down the windshield, when his phone buzzed. It was Marcus. Elias answered, expecting a question about the next day's concrete pour. The words that came through the speaker were clipped, impersonal. "Elias, we're doing some restructuring, downsizing. I'm sorry, but we have to let you go." The connection was bad, the words crackling with static, but the message was brutally clear. His sanctuary was gone, his income was gone. The last solid piece of ground beneath his feet had just given way. He sat there for a long time, the phone still pressed to his ear, long after Marcus had hung up. He felt nothing. The numbness had spread, a creeping paralysis that left him hollowed out. He drove home in a daze, the rain-slicked streets a watery, indistinct blur. He walked into the silent house, dropped his keys on the counter next to the spot where Amelia's ring had been, and mechanically scrolled through his phone, a habit he couldn't break. And that's when he saw it, a post from one of Amelia's friends, a public photo album titled "Celebrating Amelia's Promotion." The pictures were bright, filled with champagne flutes and triumphant smiles. The event was clearly at the headquarters of her firm, Sterling Croft Architectural. In the center of the main photo stood Amelia, radiant in a sharp crimson dress, her arm linked with a handsome silver-haired man he recognized from her work stories as Julian Croft. She was laughing. It was a full, unrestrained laugh, her head thrown back in genuine mirth. In the background of the photo, Elias could see the city skyline through a massive plate glass window. He recognized one of the buildings, a skyscraper his crew had just topped off last month. He had poured his sweat and skill into that steel skeleton, and now it was just a backdrop for her victory party. The juxtaposition was a physical blow. Her, ascending, celebrating, laughing in a world of glass and steel. Him, laid off, drowning, sitting in the darkness of the house she'd abandoned. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just that she had left him. It was that she was thriving on his ruins. The laughter in that photo echoed in the silent house, a mocking, phantom sound that chipped away the last of his composure. He let the phone slip from his hand, its screen cracking as it hit the tile floor. He didn't flinch. He walked into the living room and sank into the armchair, the one she had always hated, calling it old and worn. The fabric felt rough against his cheek as he leaned his head back. The weight he had been carrying for weeks, the betrayal, the debt, the worry for Chloe, the loss of his job, it all came crashing down at once. It was not a violent collapse. It was a slow, silent implosion, a scream lodged in his throat, a silent, agonizing howl of pure despair. He didn't cry. Tears felt like an inadequate response to this level of devastation. He just sat there in the deepening gloom as the grey afternoon bled into a black, starless night. He had hit the bedrock of his life. He was broken, unemployed, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. The architect of his life had left, and the foreman had just been fired from the demolition crew. There was nothing left but rubble. Hours passed. The house grew cold around him, the digital clock on the cable box glowing a mocking 2:17 a.m. He hadn't moved. He was a statue of despair in the dark living room, a man hollowed out by circumstance. The sound of a door creaking open upstairs finally broke the spell. Soft footsteps padded down the stairs. It was Chloe. She stood in the archway, a silhouette against the dim light from the hallway, clutching a worn blanket around her shoulders. She didn't speak for a long moment, just watched him. He must have been a terrifying sight, a large man swallowed by shadows, radiating a silent, bottomless grief. "Elias?" Her voice was small, fragile. "Are you okay?" The simple question, offered with such tentative care, was the catalyst. It pierced through the thick fog of his self-pity. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time in weeks. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way she chewed on her lip, the deep, abiding fear she was trying so hard to hide. He had been so consumed by his own sinking ship that he hadn't noticed she was going down with him. In that moment, seeing her terrified face, he saw the one piece of this wreckage that was not his to let go of. He was her guardian. He was her stability. He was all she had left. And he was failing her. Something shifted inside him. It wasn't a sudden burst of heroic strength. It was a low, guttural growl of pure, stubborn will. He would not sink. He would not let Amelia's departure be the final word. He would not let that laughing photograph be the epilogue to his story. He straightened up in the chair, the movement slow and aching like a man twice his age. He looked at Chloe, the darkness hiding the grim set of his jaw. "No," he said, his voice a raw rasp, "but I will be. We will be." It was a promise, a vow made in the dead of night, in the ruins of his life. He was done sinking. It was time to start building. The next morning, Elias moved with a new, deliberate purpose. The despair was still there, a cold, heavy stone in his gut, but it was now ballast, not an anchor. He made a list. It was a short, brutal accounting of his reality. No job, massive debt, a teenager to support. The first item on his agenda was capital. He needed money, and he needed it now. He walked into the garage, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and old oil. In the center, under a heavy canvas tarp, was his one true luxury, his only link to a simpler time. A 1968 Ford F-100. He and his father had spent 5 years restoring it, a painstaking labor of love. Every nut, every bolt, every coat of deep green paint was a memory. It was perfect, it was priceless, and it was all he had. Selling it felt like cutting off a limb. He met the buyer, a collector, with appreciative eyes and a thick wallet, in a sterile bank parking lot. As the man counted out the cash, Elias ran his hand over the truck's fender one last time, the cool, smooth metal, a familiar comfort. He watched the man drive it away, its rumbling engine, a sound he knew as well as his own heartbeat, until it was just a green speck in the distance. He did not allow himself to grieve. The thick stack of bills in his hand was not money. It was ammunition. It was the first brick in a new foundation. He spent the next 2 days in a ruthless triage of their finances. He paid off the highest interest credit cards first, the ones Amelia had used for clothes and spa days. He called the mortgage company, negotiating a temporary forbearance. He cut every expense that wasn't essential. The cable was disconnected, the expensive gym membership was cancelled. He started cooking every meal, simple, cheap things that filled their stomachs. It was a Spartan existence, a life stripped down to the studs. With the last of the truck money, he did something that felt both insane and essential. He enrolled in night classes at the local community college, project management, business law, and accounting. He knew how to build things with his hands. Now he needed to learn how to build an enterprise with his mind. His search for a new job was a humiliating ordeal. The construction industry was in a downturn. Foremen with his experience were a dozen for $1. He took what he could get, a low-paying job with a small, struggling outfit called O'Malley Contracting. He was no longer a foreman, he was just another laborer, swinging a hammer, hauling drywall, his hands, which had been getting softer from years of management, quickly becoming calloused and raw again. It was a brutal step backward, but it was work. It was a paycheck, and it was there, amidst the sawdust and the drone of power tools, that his path crossed with an unlikely ally. Her name was Isabella Rossi. She was an architect, and she was O'Malley's latest hire, brought on to manage their small design-build projects. Elias remembered her from a large commercial job a year ago when he was with Northgate. She had been working for Sterling Croft then, Amelia's firm. She had been fierce, brilliant, and utterly uncompromising. She had torn apart one of his subcontractor's schematics for a flaw no one else had noticed. Her critique so precise and devastating, it had become a legend among the crews. She carried an aura of intense competence that bordered on intimidating. To see her here, in the dusty, cramped trailer that served as O'Malley's office, was like seeing a thoroughbred racehorse hitched to a garbage scow. Their initial interactions were clipped and professional. She would deliver blueprints, and he would build from them. But she noticed him. She saw the way he read the plans, not just as instructions, but as a language. She saw him catch a measurement error that would have thrown off an entire load-bearing wall. She saw the quiet efficiency with which he managed the other labourers, earning their respect not through authority, but through competence. One afternoon, she found him in the trailer during his lunch break, sketching on a piece of scrap plywood. It was a modification to the roof truss design they were working on, a small change that would save time and materials without compromising integrity. She studied the sketch, her sharp, dark eyes missing nothing. "This is better," she said, her tone one of surprised approval. "Why aren't you running a crew, Vance?" "Got laid off," he said, not looking up from his sandwich. "From Northgate." "I left Sterling Croft," she offered, leaning against the doorframe. "I got tired of designing multi-million-dollar vanities for people with more money than taste. I wanted to build things that mattered." A quiet understanding passed between them. They were two professionals, adrift from the corporate world, both overqualified and underutilized. Their dynamic began to change. It was never personal, not at first. It was a partnership forged in professional respect. She would design, and he would offer practical feedback from a builder's perspective. He would point out a flaw in her plan, and she would listen without ego and adjust. They were a good team. They spoke the same language, the language of stress loads and tolerances, of form and function. In the grit and grind of that small, failing company, Elias had found his first new ally. It wasn't a grand gesture, just the quiet, steady presence of another competent person who saw the builder, not the broken man. The next 5 years were a relentless grind. Time was measured not in seasons, but in projects completed, in courses passed, in the slow, almost imperceptible healing of the wounds he carried. Elias's life became a rigid, disciplined cycle, work from dawn until dusk at O'Malley's, a quick dinner with Chloe, then hours spent hunched over textbooks, the language of contracts and liability replacing the familiar grammar of blueprints. Sleep was a luxury, a brief 4-hour intermission in a day that never seemed to end. He was perpetually tired, a deep, cellular exhaustion that settled in his bones. But beneath the fatigue, something new was being forged. The soft, trusting man Amelia had left was being burned away, replaced by someone harder, more resilient, tempered by adversity. His partnership with Isabella evolved. O'Malley, contracting, poorly managed and undercapitalized, finally went bankrupt. On the day the doors were locked for good, Isabella found Elias in the empty parking lot, staring at the shuttered building. "So?" she said, crossing her arms, a wry smile on her face. "What's next, Vance?" He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, and an idea, one that had been a distant, impossible dream, suddenly felt solid. "We could do it better," he said. And so Vance and Rossi Construction was born. They started with nothing but his old tools, her laptop, and the last of his savings from the truck sale. Their first office was his garage. Their first jobs were the ones no one else wanted: rickety deck repairs, basement renovations, leaky bathroom fixes. They were a formidable team. Isabella's designs were elegant and efficient, and Elias's execution was flawless. He was a master of logistics, of managing crews and materials, of squeezing every last drop of value out of a budget. Word of their quality and reliability began to spread. Small jobs led to bigger ones. They renovated a restaurant, then a small office building. They hired their first employee, then a full crew. Elias took out a loan, using the house as collateral, a terrifying gamble, to buy their first piece of heavy equipment. He was no longer just a builder, he was a businessman. He traded his hammer for a clipboard, his tool belt for a briefcase. The calluses on his hands softened, replaced by a permanent furrow of concentration on his brow. He learned the brutal art of the negotiation, the cold calculus of risk versus reward. Through it all, Chloe was his anchor and his motivation. With the quiet stability he provided, she began to flourish. The angry, withdrawn teenager slowly gave way to a bright, witty young woman. He attended her parent-teacher conferences, helped her study for her final exams, and felt a surge of pride that nearly buckled his knees when she was accepted into the State University's engineering program. The night before she left for college, she hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered, "for not leaving too." In that moment, all the sacrifice, the endless hours, the bone-deep weariness, it all felt worth it. He had successfully shored up the most important structure in his life. His relationship with Isabella deepened, but at a glacial pace. It was a structure they built with the same care and precision as one of their buildings, starting with a solid foundation of mutual respect. Their partnership was their primary focus, but in the quiet moments, over late-night coffees while poring over blueprints, a different connection was being forged. He saw the passion she had for her work, the elegant way her mind solved complex spatial problems. She saw the unwavering integrity he brought to every project, the quiet strength that had carried him through his personal hell. There was no grand romantic declaration. It was in small gestures, the way she'd leave a hot meal on his desk when he worked through dinner, the way he'd fix the perpetually leaky faucet in her apartment without being asked. It was a slow-burn romance, built not on whispered sweet nothings, but on the shared language of competence and loyalty. It was a partnership of equals, a bond tested by stress and sealed by shared success. After 3 years of working side by side, a quiet dinner turned into a conversation that lasted until dawn, and by the end of it they were no longer just business partners. The home he had lost with Amelia, a place of style but no substance, was slowly being replaced by something far more real, built with a woman who understood that the strongest structures are built from the inside out. 7 years. 7 years of relentless work. Vance & Rossi was no longer a garage-based startup. It was a mid-sized, highly respected development firm with a sleek downtown office and a portfolio of impressive projects. Elias Vance was no longer the broken man laid off from a foreman job. He was a respected developer, a man whose name on a project was a guarantee of quality. He wore tailored suits now, the fabric a stark contrast to the rough work clothes of his past. The temples of his dark hair were threaded with silver, a testament to the years of stress and sleepless nights. He had become powerful, strategic, and formidable. He had built an empire not of dirt and concrete, but of reputation and resilience, and he had almost forgotten the ghost that had set him on this path. Almost. The past returned on a crisp autumn afternoon. Elias was in his office, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city he was helping to reshape. His intercom buzzed. It was his assistant. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice hesitant. "There's a woman here to see you, an Amelia Croft. She doesn't have an appointment." The name hit him like a physical impact, a ghost limb suddenly aching with a long-forgotten pain. 7 years. He hadn't heard her name, hadn't spoken it, in 7 years. A cold, calm stillness settled over him. The man he was now was not the man she had left. This was a confrontation he had, on some subconscious level, been preparing for since the day he found her note. "Send her in," he said, his voice perfectly even. She walked in, and for a moment he felt a flicker of something. Not love, not nostalgia, but a distant, clinical pity. The years had not been kind. The vibrant, confident woman from the promotion party photograph was gone. This Amelia was thinner, her expensive clothes hanging loosely on her frame. There were fine lines of stress around her eyes and mouth that no amount of makeup could hide. The arrogance she had worn like a shield had been replaced by a brittle, desperate energy. She looked around his office at the custom-built mahogany desk, the original architectural renderings framed on the walls, the sweeping view of the city, and a flicker of disbelief crossed her face. This was not the world she had left him in. "Elias," she began, her voice trying for a warm, familiar tone that didn't quite land. "You look good." "Amelia," he replied, his voice flat, neutral. He did not stand. He did not offer her a seat. He simply waited. Her facade began to crack under his silent, patient gaze. The practiced smile faltered. She launched into a performance of remorse, a well-rehearsed monologue about the terrible mistake she had made. She spoke of Julian, how he had turned out to be a fraud, how his firm, Sterling Croft, was on the verge of collapse after a series of disastrous investments. He had lost everything, she lamented, and had left her with nothing. She painted herself as a victim, a woman led astray by ambition, and a charismatic liar. She cried carefully, making sure not to smudge her mascara. It was a masterful performance, designed to elicit pity, to prey on the memory of the man he used to be. Elias listened without interruption. He watched her the way he would watch a subcontractor trying to explain away a shoddy piece of work. He saw the calculations in her eyes, the desperate search for an emotional lever to pull. When she finally finished, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue, he spoke, his voice still devoid of emotion. "Why are you here, Amelia?" The directness of the question threw her. I made a mistake, Elias. I never should have left. I see that now. I see what you've built, and I—" She trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the office, at his success. The plea was clear. She wanted back in. She had seen his empire and wanted to be queen. "There's nothing for you here," he said, the words as cold and hard as steel. "We have nothing to discuss." He pressed the button on his intercom. "Sarah, please show Mrs. Croft out." Panic flashed in her eyes. The pity play had failed. She had underestimated him, had mistaken the quiet, heartbroken man she had left for the man sitting before her. Her desperation curdled into something ugly. "You can't just dismiss me, Elias," she hissed, her voice rising. "Don't you forget, we are still married. We never divorced." He didn't react, his expression unchanging. He had not forgotten. In the chaotic years of survival and building, filing the paperwork had been a low priority, an administrative task he had perpetually pushed off. He had assumed she had filed. It was a loose end, an oversight, and now she was trying to use it as a noose. "That company you've built," she continued, a venomous triumph in her voice. "This beautiful office, all of it. Under the law, half of it is mine. My lawyer says I have a very strong claim. You can throw me out today, but I'll be back, and I will take half of everything you have." She stood there, defiant, believing she had finally found the right weapon, that she had him cornered. She was threatening to take the thing he had spent 7 years of his life, his blood and sweat, building from the ashes she had left behind. She mistook his silence for shock, for fear. She did not understand that for a man like Elias Vance, a man who plans every detail, who anticipates every point of failure, a loose end is not an oversight. It is an opportunity. Elias finally leaned forward, steepling his fingers on the polished surface of his desk. The cold, calm demeanor he had maintained throughout her performance was gone, replaced by something far more chilling, a quiet, absolute certainty. The look in his eyes was not of a man cornered, but of a predator who had just watched his prey walk willingly into a meticulously prepared trap. "You're right, Amelia," he began, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "We are still married. And your lawyer is also right. You would have a claim to half of my assets. It would be a messy, protracted, and very expensive fight." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing her a moment of fleeting victory. Her smile was a triumphant sneer. "But," he continued, the single word cutting through her confidence like a diamond blade through glass, "you seem to be operating under a few critical misapprehensions. The first is that I am the same man you left 7 years ago. The second, and far more significant, is that you understand the game we are playing." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her, looking down at the city below. "You see, when you left, you taught me a valuable lesson. Never leave your flank exposed. Never assume loyalty, and always have a contingency plan." He turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "For the past 18 months, I've been watching Sterling Croft. I watched Julian's reckless expansion, his leveraged gambles. I knew he was going to implode. It was just a matter of when. So I started preparing." He walked back to his desk and picked up a thick, leather-bound folder. He tossed it onto the desk in front of her. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "While you were living your life of ambition, I was quietly, through a series of shell corporations and third-party brokers, buying up Sterling Croft's debt. The banks were only too happy to offload it. As of this morning, I am the firm's single largest creditor." Amelia's face had gone pale, the triumphant flush draining away, replaced by a waxy, sickly pallor. She stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. What does that mean?" she stammered. "It means," Elias said, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, "that when Julian's last financial partner pulled out last week, the board was faced with immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy. They needed a lifeline, and I was there to offer one." He leaned across the desk, his eyes locking onto hers, devoid of any warmth or pity. "At a board meeting held 2 hours ago, my offer to assume the company's debt in exchange for a controlling interest was unanimously accepted. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Amelia, I own your company. I own your job. I am your boss. The silence in the room was absolute. Amelia sank into the chair opposite his desk, her legs seemingly unable to support her. The colour had drained completely from her face. She looked utterly, profoundly broken. But Elias was not finished. He had not spent years planning this moment to leave any room for doubt, any possibility of a counterattack. "That brings me to your leverage," he went on, his voice relentless. "Your threat to take half of my company. It's a compelling one, but it relies on the assumption that you have nothing to lose. That is also incorrect." He tapped the folder. "This isn't just financial data, Amelia. For the past year, I've also had a private investigator compiling a rather comprehensive file on you and Julian. It turns out when he was cooking the books to secure those loans he defaulted on, he had an accomplice. Someone on the inside who helped him falsify project reports and inflate revenue projections. Someone whose signature is on some very incriminating documents." He let the implications sink in. "I imagine the district attorney's office would be very interested to learn how the firm's star architect was also a key player in defrauding its investors. A conviction for corporate fraud carries a sentence of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Your legal claim against me would seem rather insignificant from inside a prison cell." This was the secret weapon, the final, devastating blow. He had not just built a shield, he had forged a sword. He had anticipated her every move, her every point of leverage, and had prepared a counter for each one that was not just defensive, but utterly annihilating. Her threat to take half his assets was met with his power to take all of her freedom. Her attempt at emotional manipulation was met with a cold, irrefutable presentation of facts. He had learned the language of her world, the world of leverage, of power, of ruthless strategy, and he had become more fluent in it than she could ever have imagined. The showdown was over. She had brought a knife to a war she didn't even know was being fought, and he had just revealed his control of the entire battlefield. Amelia stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. The arrogant, manipulative woman was gone, stripped away layer by layer, until all that remained was a terrified, defeated shell. All the fight had gone out of her. She was a building whose foundations had just been vaporized. She had come here to lay claim to his empire, only to discover that he had already conquered hers. She finally found her voice, a choked, broken whisper. You planned this?" "No," Elias said, the first hint of emotion, a cold, hard finality entering his voice. "You did. The day you left that note on the counter. You set all of this in motion." "You taught me how to play the long game. I just learned the lesson better than you did." He straightened up, the moment of confrontation over. The tension in the room had dissipated, replaced by the sterile atmosphere of a business transaction that had reached its conclusion. He pressed the intercom button again. "Sarah, security to my office, please. Mrs. Croft is leaving." He turned his back on her then, walking back to the window and looking out at the city. He didn't need to watch her be escorted out. He didn't need to see her final broken expression. His victory was not in her destruction, but in his own survival. The satisfaction he felt was not a hot, fiery triumph, but a cool, quiet peace. It was the feeling of a heavy weight, one he had been carrying for 7 years, finally being lifted from his shoulders. It was the clean, satisfying click of a lock falling into place. A chapter, long and painful, was finally, irrevocably closed. The office door opened and closed. He heard the soft footsteps of security guards and Amelia's muffled, incoherent protests as she was led away. A moment later, another set of footsteps approached, lighter, more familiar. Isabella came to stand beside him at the window. She had been in the adjoining conference room, had heard everything through the open door he had deliberately left ajar. She didn't speak, just placed a warm hand on his arm. The simple, solid contact was an anchor, pulling him from the cold depths of the past back into the present. He turned from the window, away from the ghost of his former life, and looked at her. He looked at the woman who had stood by him in the trenches, who had helped him lay every brick of this new life. Her dark eyes were filled with a fierce, quiet pride. She had seen the man he was when he had nothing, and she had helped him become the man he was today. He saw in her face not just his partner in business, but his partner in life. The empire he had built wasn't the glass and steel of the city skyline or the impressive balance sheet of Vance and Rossi. It was this quiet strength, this unwavering loyalty, this partnership forged in fire and concrete. A faint, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time that day. The last of the tension drained from his shoulders, leaving him feeling lighter than he had in years. The war was over. The ghosts were banished. The wreckage had been cleared, and on the site stood something strong, beautiful, and built to last. He had not just rebuilt his life, he had upgraded the design entirely. The foundation was sound. They stood there for a long moment, the silence in the office no longer heavy with confrontation, but filled with the comfortable peace of a shared future. Outside, the city hummed with life, a complex machine of which they were now an integral part. Below them, a new project was underway, a skeletal steel frame rising from the ground, a Vance and Rossi project. It was a library, a public space, a place for knowledge and community. It was one of the projects Isabella had always wanted to build, one of the things that mattered. Elias thought of the two women. One who had seen him as a stepping stone and had tried to tear down his life for her own gain. The other who had seen him as a partner and had helped him build, piece by piece, something better than either of them could have achieved alone. The contrast was stark, a clear architectural drawing of two vastly different lives. One was a facade, beautiful on the outside but structurally unsound. The other was built with integrity from the foundation up. He reached out and took Isabella's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Her hand was strong, capable, the hand of a creator. It felt like home. The sense of relief was profound, a deep, cleansing exhale that seemed to release the last vestiges of the past 7 years. The cold satisfaction of his victory over Amelia was already fading, replaced by a warm, quiet joy. The vanquishing had been a necessary act of closure, a final demolition of a condemned structure. But his focus was not on the rubble. It was on the new skyline they were building together. Later that evening, he and Isabella picked up Chloe from her university apartment for dinner. She was in her final year, a confident and brilliant young woman on the cusp of her own career. As they sat in a small, bustling restaurant, the easy conversation flowing between the three of them, Elias felt a sense of profound contentment. This was his family, not one of chance or obligation, but one of choice, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared struggle. Chloe talked excitedly about her senior project, a bridge design, and Isabella listened intently, offering sharp, insightful critiques that Chloe eagerly scribbled down on a napkin. Elias watched them, a silent, happy observer. He had not just raised Chloe, he had given her a role model in Isabella, a powerful, intelligent woman who treated her as an equal. After dinner, they drove to a hill overlooking the city. From this vantage point, the skyline was a glittering tapestry of light. Elias pointed out the buildings they had built. The sleek office tower, the restored historical hotel, the The new library, its frame lit by work lights as the night crew continued their work. Each one was a monument to their shared effort, a physical manifestation of their journey from a dusty garage to the heights of the city. Chloe leaned her head on his shoulder. "You really did it, Elias," she said softly. "You built it all back." He put his arm around her, pulling her close. Isabella stood on his other side, her shoulder pressed against his. "We built it," he corrected her gently, looking at Isabella. "We built it together." The empire was not the buildings. The buildings were just steel and glass, concrete and wire. The true empire was this feeling, right here on this dark hill. It was the unwavering loyalty of the woman beside him and the deep, familial love for the young woman on his other side. It was the peace that came from knowing he had not only survived, but had created something of lasting value, something that could never be taken from him. He had faced the ghost of his past and had shown her the door, not with rage, but with the quiet, unshakable power of a life well built. He had won the war, and his reward was this profound, simple peace. He looked out at the lights, at the city stretching to the horizon. The future was not a terrifying void, but a landscape of possibility, a series of blueprints waiting to be brought to life. He felt the weight of his past finally, completely lift. He was no longer a man defined by what was taken from him, but by what he had built in its place. He breathed in the cool night air, a deep, cleansing breath. "Let's go home," he said. And for the first time in a very long time, the word felt completely and utterly true.